Good morning, Alistair. Thank you for being our guest today on the Break Even podcast.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So first of all, I'd like to start with, can you tell me a bit about who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. My name's Alistair Barfield, Ali. Everyone calls me Ali. I run an organization called Deflect and Protect. We're a CIC, so we're a non-profit community interest corporation. And our goal is to assist young people to stay protected online. Our primary methods are training sessions and consultancy work based around autism and extremism. And more recently, we've been doing a lot of work in sort of neurodiversity and gambling, particularly harmful gambling behaviours and how that intersects with Generation Alpha.
Fantastic. For those listening, Alistair, can you explain to us a bit about what ADHD and autism actually is?
Sure. So I'm autistic ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was 7, which is pretty typical for boys. It's much later for girls for a variety of factors. They are developmental disorders. So autistic spectrum disorder, we're thinking it's moving towards being called autistic spectrum condition soon, is a social disorder. It's a condition, a social condition that affects the way in which we interact socially. So they're incredibly nuanced, but there are sort of universal aspects to it. So issues with social communication, struggling to maintain eye contact or understanding nonverbal cues or subtext. That's pretty typical for autism, as well as obsessive interests. ADHD is a disorder characterized by things like inattentiveness, impulsivity, and obviously hyperactivity.
Thank you very much for that. A great explanation. How has it affected you both when you were younger and now as an adult, Alistair?
Sure. So I was 7. I was diagnosed approximately a month before I was permanently excluded from my primary school. How has it affected me? When I was younger,
So when you were excluded,
Sure.
Was that due to your condition, do you think?
Oh yeah, it absolutely, definitely was. Yeah, the school couldn't manage me. This is back in the 90s when these things were sort of not well known.
Yeah.
And how does it affect me then? In a similar way to how it affects me now. I still struggle. I have almost no empathy as a person. Still struggle with it today. I have a Rolodex in the back of my mind of what I call crying faces, so I can tell when someone's about to cry. But if they don't pull one of these faces, I have no idea it's coming.
Right.
My ADHD affects me. I'm still very impulsive. I still have issues around inattentiveness and impulsivity, hyperactivity. It'll still be 2:00 in the morning and I'll want to clean the kitchen. And I have to have a discussion with myself that's like, no, you're supposed to wind down.
Right.
So that's how it affects me.
Thank you. I've heard before that betting shops and casinos can be very overwhelming for those on the autism spectrum. Why is that, Alistair, in your words?
Sure. So I think an important aspect of autism to note is struggle with oversensory stimuli. So things like bright lights, flashing lights, bright sounds, too many people. So we can think about the way in which betting shops and casinos are structured in a way that is uniquely non-neuro-inclusive. So traditionally, I often describe a casino as being my nightmare. It didn't stop my wife taking me to one on our first date though.
Right.
But still, yes. So those oversensory stimuli can really affect us as a community, which is why traditionally we've avoided spaces like that.
So I assume, Alistair, that this must mean if someone with autism wanted to gamble, they're a lot more likely to turn to online gambling. That's going to suit them a lot better, yeah?
Absolutely. If we think about the way it's structured as well, online gambling, it's uniquely predisposed towards ADHD and autism. And I suppose the important thing to note when we're talking about gambling related harms is that ADHD and autistic people do have a greater risk of addictive behaviors. So currently, autistic people in the UK die approximately 6 years earlier than non-autistic people. And there's two major reasons for this. The first is that we struggle with figures of authority. So we don't want to go to the doctor. This is partly due to our experiences with school, social workers, and things like that. And the other factor to note is our addictive tendencies. So our risk of being addicted to anything is much greater. So if we think about our access to online gambling and the way in which apps now work, it uniquely predisposes autistic and ADHD people to harmful gambling behaviors using those forms of gambling.
Thanks for that great explanation. Can you talk a little bit about the gamification of gambling and the impact this may have on the autistic community?
Sure. So if we're talking about autism specifically, I think it's important to note special interests. So autistic people have special interests. We have things that we're obsessed with. We used to call them obsessions, but that has sort of a negative connotation. So we call them special interests now. My own personal special interest is video games. I could tell you everything about the history of video games. Because when we love something, we don't just love it on a surface level. We want to become like knowledgeable to an absurd extent on the topic.
So you have to know everything about it, how it started, where it's going, absolutely everything.
Yeah, no, I could literally write a book on the history of video games.
Right.
I had a half-an-hour discussion last night about the share price of a large video game company dropping and where that will impact the greater industry as a whole. So yes, I'm obsessed with this. So when we're looking at sort of gamification of gambling, and when I'm talking about gamification of gambling, I'm really, really talking about things like online casinos that use what I would consider to be sort of basic mobile phone style games. This predisposes us to, it's already in a format that we enjoy, that we are uniquely predisposed to already through our own special interests, but it also preys on our struggles with impulse control, with that inattentiveness, with that lack of foresight, I suppose I always describe it as. So we've got a sort of perfect storm of factors around my community as a whole for why this has been happening.
Sure. So Alistair, loot boxes are something we hear a lot about, and it's the pathway it leads into gambling. Can you tell us a bit more about loot boxes and all the things around gaming that lead people into gambling, where perhaps they don't even think they're gambling?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to know that loot boxes starts with gachapon. Loot boxes starts in the 1980s in Japan, and then it becomes popularized in a physical form in Pokemon cards. Now, for those of you listening that don't know what a loot box is, it's essentially a Pokemon card pack in real life. There's a random, in the online world, there's a random chance of gaining something special from it. Now, unlike Pokemon cards, loot boxes can't be sold or traded in most forms. I think what's important to note here is that loot boxes are so profitable that the man who invented the entire concept of the modern loot box is called Andrew Wilson. He invented it for FIFA, the football game, video game series I'm sure we're all aware of. It was so profitable, he's now the CEO of the entire company. It's important to note how problematic it can be, unfortunately, loot boxes. Now, what's happened with loot boxes in recent years is there's been a massive, massive backlash in sort of your hardcore gamers like myself around loot boxes. We don't engage in video games with loot boxes. So what they've done, and this is a really interesting point that I think that we forget, is that a lot of loot box related games now are specifically marketed towards young women. There's a number of mobile, iPad, Nintendo Switch style games that are very accessible, very playable in any format, and are specifically geared towards that market. Young, impressionable women. And I think that's a really interesting point to note, is that the harms that may come from loot boxes are now being twisted to a community that traditionally we wouldn't see marketed towards in the gambling space.
Thanks for that. That's quite fascinating and also very worrying, isn't it?
Yes, it's particularly worrying because all of these games are not based in the UK. So regulation becomes a minefield.
Thanks for that. Could you explain some of the traits or behaviours that may link a person with ADHD or autism to problem gambling, so we could, as a wider community, perhaps understand that more?
Yeah, so I think we need to look at in particularly about impulse control from an ADHD perspective, and we need to look at sort of coping mechanisms from an autistic perspective. So when we're talking about impulse control, it really is, as it sounds, it's the Ron seal of aspects. It's lack of foresight. It's impulse control in ADHD. I always describe as, I used to have a student, and if you put a pen in front of him, it doesn't matter what else was going on, he will pick up the pen and disassemble the pen, because he is incapable of not having that impulse, or he'll throw it across the classroom. Not because he's misbehaving, but because that voice in the back of his mind says, "What if you throw it across the classroom?" So I think what we're seeing is that predisposure to impulse control, that lack of foresight. So, and the way in which gambling in particular is being portrayed in online communities is often as a get-rich-quick scheme or a positive thing. So we can see how it's slowly seeping in. There's some interesting stats from America around people with ADHD and autism already on therapeutic interventions for harmful gambling behaviors, and we are overrepresented in these fields.
Do you feel people with neurodiversity may be more susceptible to gambling influence, such as the advertising that we're bombarded with and content engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. If you see an advert that says free 20 quid to bet on a football match, why wouldn't you? Especially if your special interest is already a form of something that's adjacent to gambling. So if your special interest is football and gambling is so ingrained in football, or your special interest is esports and gambling is becoming increasingly ingrained in the esports world, then we can see why an advertisement that uniquely appeals to you. Because the algorithm is neither a negative or a positive thing. It farms clicks and content. And if it knows people that play Valorant are more likely to bet on Valorant, then it will show you adverts for Valorant gambling.
Yeah. One thing that's come across to me, you're very passionate about the issues surrounding neurodiversity. I mean, you spoke at our first National Gambling Support Network conference. I met you at the Beacons conference a few months back. So we're really aware that you're passionate about the issues surrounding neurodiversity and harmful gambling behaviours, especially around online influencers. Can you explain a bit more about this, please?
Yeah, so I always talk about parasocial relationships. Anybody that's ever heard me speak about gambling is probably sick of me saying that. But the way a parasocial relationship dynamic works is the influence with which influencers have by their name is much greater than any form of celebrity we've ever seen. So a parasocial relationship is a one-way form of attachment. This particularly affects young people, as well as neurodivergent people who may have entire online communities to base their social networks on. So the way it works is the more in which you engage with an influencer, the more their word of mouth has a similarity towards a friend or a relative. So we know from studies that word of mouth advertising from influencers is arguably the greatest way to advertise anything. So what's been happening in particular is influencers are being given tremendous amounts of money, tens and tens of millions of dollars to gamble online, particularly influencers with very large neurodivergent fan bases and particularly influencers who are neurodivergent themselves. Now, this ties directly into the way in which young people consume content. I think as older people, we have an assumption that a young person goes home and plays the game. If I want to watch The Sopranos, I will watch The Sopranos. Young people don't do this. Their content consumption is both passive and active. The average watch time for the world's largest streamer is 7.5 hours.
Wow.
Young people are going home, putting a stream on, playing a video game, and flicking through social media all at the same time. So we're getting active participation and passive participation. And the truth is that when passive participation happens from a neuropsychology standpoint, it's almost closer to something like propaganda. So if the message is reinforced and reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and the parasocial dynamic is abused, then we can see why this is happening at such a large rate.
Thanks for that. And thanks again for your really passionate answers, even in this podcast. I'm sure people listening will really learn a lot from what you've been talking about, Alistair. The thing I'd like to finish up with really is, what do you think needs to happen or could happen to educate those about the risks of gambling in your communities we're talking about?
Sure. So I think there's a couple things we need to know. When we're looking at engaging with communities, it can be incredibly difficult when they are so widely spread out. And I think that's the most important thing. So what I would look at is I would look at educating young people still in schools, and I would look at educating the wider neurodivergent community. So let's start with schools. Now, we know that media literacy is already being embedded in PSHCE lessons. I think financial literacy with a keen eye towards gambling harms needs to be embedded. That's always my recommendation. I would like to see interventions. I would like to see former problem gamblers coming and speaking to young people, because fundamentally the way we learn is through communication. We discuss. We don't like to be taught at or talked at. We like to have those conversations. That's really meaningful. So I would like to see gambling harms embedded in the national school curriculum. I really would. Particularly, I would like to see it embedded in sixth forms and colleges, because we are starting to see the ramifications of what's been happening. Now, from a neurodivergent standpoint, this is increasingly difficult. Neurodivergent people are spread out. I would like to see regulation happen, particularly around advertising and gambling. I'm very passionate about that. I'd like to see more regulation on influencers being advertised, regardless of whether it's gambling behaviors or it's makeup or clothes or whatever it might be. I would like to see more regulation around that and more accountability for influencers. But from a neurodivergent standpoint, I'd like to see community-based education lessons and interventions. I'd like to see parents being educated. I'd like to go to autistic social groups in universities and schools and in the wider community as a whole, because I think this is something that's bubbling under the surface. And the big thing for me is that I think we're in a very, very fortunate position in Britain where we can be proactive. We rely so much on being reactive as a country, but we can actually be proactive. We can actually make a real difference before Generation Alpha become 18. We've got 4 years until the oldest Gen Alphas become 18. So we can make a real difference.
And let's really hope on what you've just said that we do. There's some people listening to this that can pass these messages on and be proactive, because the world would be a better place for what we're talking about if some of these things were put in place.
Absolutely.
Alistair, that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for another passionate conversation. And I really look forward to seeing you at the Gamble Away conference on Wednesday, the 4th of December.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak. It's going to be wonderful, and you'll get a sort of speed run, as we would say in the gaming community, of these talking points. But I'll be there to talk and discuss this at a wider length as well, because I think it's really important.
Look forward to seeing you there, Alistair.
You too, Ian.
And thank you very much for being a part of the Break Even podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ian. I appreciate it.
If you or someone you know is affected by gambling-related harm, please call us on 01273 833 722 or visit our website www.breakeven.org.uk. Alternatively, please call the National Gambling Helpline on 0808 8020 133. Please ensure to like and subscribe to all our social media channels and keep this message out there. Thank you.